Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ultimate guide to scrupulosity treatments. I'm Justin K. Hughes, and I'm joined today by Jonathan Abramowitz, Jon Hershfield, and Alec Pollard. And we are excited to be here for the online OCD conference. Just a quick outline. We're going to do this welcome, brief history of OCD, basics of OCD treatments, and then we're going to get into it. Key considerations for scrupulosity from key experts as well, and then jump into case consultation Q&A about the speakers. You have the slides, feel free to read this. I also included extra slides than what I'll cover here today. So if you'd like to know more about us or any of the details, hope you download the PDF of the slides. Learning objectives are included as well. So let's get to it, y'all. A brief history of OCD. Well, what's interesting about OCD history is that a history of OCD is a history of scrupulosity, in fact. So it's likely been around for a long time. Symptoms of OCD, as we've understood them, have been accurately described, at least parts of it, throughout history. So obsessions against one's wishes, the commonality of depression, that chronic and episodic nature, and other things as well. So when we go back to where it might have first shown up, we have to understand the language we are using. Cicero ultimately used the Latin word scrupus, which was referencing a rough or sharp stone. And then later it developed into scruple, which described reluctance in decisions and conscientious doubts. Shakespeare also used scruple to talk about a small quantity, weight, or measure. So what's interesting is that clergy were really some of the first on the scene. So they were some of the first to be hearing of the inner world. And even today, clergy statistically are the ones that are going to hear about it first of all, most of all. Doctors oftentimes are a close second, but not even necessarily with scrupulosity, with more obsessions, compulsions, etc. And so long list of different folks. Starting in the 1400s, it was actually arguably the first full autobiography that was ever written by Marjorie Kemp, a lady with OCD, arguably, from what we can gather at this point. So looking back, long history. And as we understand a little bit more through the lens of clergy, we can see that not only are they that front door, but they were picking up on all sorts of things that are commonly comorbid with OCD, like depression. Here's an example. Jeremy Taylor, back in the Church of England. Scruple is a little stone in the foot. If you set it upon the ground, it hurts you. If you hold it up, you cannot go forward. It's a trouble where trouble is over, a doubt when doubts are resolved. Another example of someone who couldn't go over a bridge or come near a pool, rock, or steep hill because they're afraid that they might impulsively throw themselves over. Lots of different examples. Again, you can read through in the notes. And there were some early attempts. Yes, there were certainly misinterpretations, abuses of power, all sorts of different, just wild perspectives. And yes, there's certainly plenty of examples of just attributing immediately to demon possession, demon oppression, fill in the blank. But there were also a lot of different attempts to walk with folks and to use some strategies that a few are not dissimilar to some things that we do today, but certainly not treatment as we know it. And it's just quite fascinating, actually, to dig into some of these examples. Jeremy Taylor is probably one of the most obvious. Number 4 here from one of his books called Of the Scrupulous Conscience. When someone acts, they're to use the same reference or measure as to when the action was made. Very interesting. Talking about the changing of the goalposts, so to speak, when seeing obsessions show up. So it had a lot of different feedback that, again, wasn't treatment as we understand it today, but some ideas. The early medical references, too, were all over the place. By and large, outside of biology, OCD was seen as some disorder of intellect, will, or emotions, and you can trace the history in different ways. Monomania or partial insanity was a concept that predated neurosis, which was the big one by the late 1800s. And ultimately, it was a German psychiatrist who came up with, I don't know if my guys can pronounce this here, but Zwangsvorstellung, which was the compelled presentation idea. And it was the first separate category of something that could be a diagnosis of OCD, even though they included a lot of disorders in that as well. So there's just so much to cover in the history of it. But fast forward to the behaviorists, Joseph Wolpe with systematic desensitization, then Victor Meyer, who was the first to publish an article on the treatment of OCD with exposure that involved a cognitive component. So fast forward to where we are today. And our current understanding is a mental health disorder in 3 parts: obsessions, compulsions, and disruption. And I'm not going to go into all those details because if you're here today, especially as a clinician, let's hope you've had a primer already. So a lot of things aren't unique, such as the OCD cycle in general. And the basics of OCD treatment, CBT, using ERP as the gold standard, SRIs as well for medication. There are other evidence-based treatments, but truly exposure and response prevention is that gold standard of care. It's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. Let's get to it. We're going to jump into what exactly is scrupulosity? What does it look like? And I'd really like to ask Jon Hershfield to weigh in at the beginning here of what scrupulosity looks like. Jon?
Thanks, Justin. So was that term Zwangsvorstellung?
Zwangsvorstellung. I'm probably butchering that, but yes.
I think my grandmother had that. Zwangsvorstellung. So what does scrupulosity look like? It's a good question. Justin just did a great job of describing sort of the history of OCD through the lens of scrupulosity. And that word keeps coming up. It's something small, something painful. So it's really about getting caught up in the details. And usually when we hear the term scrupulosity, we're referring specifically to religious scrupulosity. Somebody says, I have scrupulosity OCD, or I have scrupulosity. We already know quite a bit about what, at least we think we know quite a bit about what they're experiencing, which is they have some sort of connection to some sort of faith or faith tradition or religion. And that religion is characterized by a series of guidelines and rules and principles and a culture and a way of behaving. And the person is struggling to deal with any tiny amount of uncertainty regarding how they're relating to their faith. So in some cases, it might be just a struggle to know that you're performing your rituals perfectly, right? So there might be a specific way that your faith tradition asks you to pray. It might be a certain number of times, or in a certain order, or certain repetition, or in certain spaces, or under certain conditions, with clean hands, or wearing a certain outfit or something like that. And the OCD is right there saying like, yeah, but how do you know for sure that you're doing it the exact right way? Right? Maybe you should do it, 10 more times to be sure, or you should do it this very specific way. And Justin, you mentioned sort of the moving of the goalpost, right? So then what happens is you pray one more time, this time, with real, vigor, right? And then still not enough, maybe one more time after that, right? So it's you're never kind of satisfying the OCD. And I like to think about all kinds of OCD as essentially being a problem of contamination. In this case, it's the contamination of my relationship to my God or my religion or my faith, right? If I don't pray perfectly, now that relationship has become contaminated. So I'm going to pray perfectly, and I'm going to add all of these rituals, and that will sort of cleanse my relationship with my faith. And sometimes it's more of a contaminant of the identity, like maybe I don't really believe in my faith, or maybe I'm going to be pulled into believing in another faith if I look at this book, that isn't from my faith tradition or something like that. Another common way this manifests is simply the problem of having unwanted intrusive thoughts when you're trying to be pure, when you're trying to connect with God. And so it might be intrusive sexual thoughts or violent thoughts, or it might be thoughts specifically about God or a deity that you pray to, or people in your church or synagogue or things like that. The OCD is always on you to sort of tell you to think the wrong thing at the exact wrong time, and then ask you to do something about it and to fix it and to take personal responsibility for the arising of these thoughts. Another thing that happens in scrupulosity is we have more than just institutional religions that guide our principles. We also have culture. And so sometimes People develop what we might call moral scrupulosity, where instead of it being a concern with God or Allah or Jesus or anything like that, the concern is really with society, with people. And what does the predominant culture in which I live say about people who do this or eat that or go to these places or like these things? So then this kind of morphs into this concern about being a good person. The OCD defines people as good or bad, and then you're struggling to figure out how I know for sure that I'm good. I know that I don't want to be bad. And sometimes we have religion to sort of guide us here in terms of there are things called sins and there are things called mitzvahs and things like that. But outside of that scope, we have whatever happens to be on Twitter in a given moment, or or TikTok or something like that, sort of telling us how to be in the world. And then again, that scruple, that little sharp stone in your shoe, is the part that's telling you you're not doing it right. You need to do more, and you need to cleanse yourself of whatever your immorality is. It might be an obsession about something in your past that, upon reflection, you believe you acted immorally. It might be a concern with something that's going on in politics, like political correctness or whatever kind of trends you're seeing on TV, worrying about in a way that is above and beyond just being conscientious and interested in the world. This is about demanding certainty that you aren't having racist thoughts, for example, or you aren't having thoughts against somebody's religion or something like that, or judging someone's appearance or being ableist or something like that. So it creates this kind of religious quality to it, even without the religion. And I'm going on quite a bit, so I'll end on this part of it, which is I think that moral scrupulosity in particular is very much connected to all the other themes of OCD, in that with every theme of OCD, there's this question of who am I to make the decision to move on? What makes me so great and so knowledgeable and so decent to know my hands are clean enough, I can stop washing them, or to know that's just a violent, intrusive thought. I'm not going to murder my baby or something. I can leave that. Why, where do I get the credibility? And that's what I think the OCD really goes after in moral scrupulosity, is it positions you as not being a credible resource. It challenges your intelligence. Like, who am I to make the moral decision of calling this OCD and not a religious problem, or calling this OCD and not a health problem? And again, the good news is we have treatments for OCD. It responds very well to ERP and related approaches, and more importantly, to being creative and flexible and learning to see yourself as a whole person without the OCD demanding that you kind of lock it down and define good versus bad. I am a person of average moral integrity, and I'm completely okay with that.
Thank you so much, Jon. Alec, we wanted you to really weigh in on the preparation of somebody who has scrupulosity, especially in treatment with ERP, and to really consider steps that are involved. So we'd love to get your take on that.
Well, I'd be happy to. Thanks for inviting me, by the way. I just want to say to Jon, I aspire to have average morality. You've given me average. You've given me something to shoot for. All right.
You should quit. You should give up, Alec. You're not going to make it.
Oh, you want me to have realistic goals? Oh, okay. I guess that's the way it's supposed to be. All right. I did want to say just real quick, I know it's a little off topic, but I just had the pleasure of reviewing Ian Osborne's new book on Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, excuse me.
I've not heard of Martin Luther. Wow, that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah. And next book is going to be on Martin Luther, so it's really going to be good. Yeah. But he's not giving me any kickback here, but it's really good. And it illustrates a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today in Martin Luther's life. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about prepping people for ERP. One of the, I think, most common errors I see in my colleagues with ERP, with scrupulosity, is rushing it too quickly when they're not prepared cognitively for this. And if we think about how terribly sensitive these issues are, it's not that the other OCD issues aren't, but there does seem to be something very special about scrupulosity. The stakes are pretty high. Eternal damnation, God's disfavor, we can go on. And even if it's just moral scrupulosity, there's these horrible not right feelings that people will have to endure. So if you go rushing in too quick, you're not going to get great adherence, in my opinion. So you really need to prepare them. And the focus of most of the preparation for me is cognitive, in this sense that that people with scrupulosity have been battered about between reassurance providers and their OCD back and forth, and they've often lost sight intellectually of what they really truly believe. And I'm clear that most of them kind of know what they believe, but they just are afraid to say it out loud, to commit to it. And so we have developed sort of a process by which we have them make those commitments to beliefs way before we start ERP. And I've developed a worksheet called the PISA worksheet. And PISA does not stand for a round pie or a leaning tower. It is stands for possibly immoral or sinful acts. And so the pieces are the things they worry about, the thoughts they have, whether they're dressing too provocatively, whether they were totally genuine when they said, "I'm fine today, thank you." Whatever the thing is they worry about is either sinful or wrong. We write that on the top of the page, and then we do an exercise to try to help them develop and clarify their beliefs. So we ask them, is it always sinful or immoral? Is it sometimes, or is it never? And they have to make a commitment to that. And if it's sometimes, they have to specify the conditions under which that they believe the act itself is sinful or immoral. And then we ask them, if you do slip and engage in this behavior, what do you believe the consequences are? Now, that could range for anything from extreme guilt to eternity in hell. And I have to admit, that's not good. Eternity in hell. I mean, that's going to ruin your weekend at least. Yeah. So I don't want that myself either. And then, so usually it's something not very good, right? And then we ask them, do you believe there's any way out? If you've done this and you have the threat of this catastrophic event, what's your way out? And really, quite frankly, most major religions have very nice ways out, very rational, functional. But the problem with scrupulosity is not that they're too religious, it's they're not using their religion the way it was designed to be. Because whether it's confession or prayer or asking for forgiveness, making a commitment to do good deeds, whatever it is, they're not using those processes for dealing with some of the issues that are so common in scrupulosity. So scrupulosity is not being super religious. It's the opposite. You're not actually following your faith traditions. And that's how we try to get people to engage in this. We want to get you to the point where you can be a better whatever it is you are, that you can really follow your faith. OCD is the enemy. So then when we get down to, well, what can you do? We try to encourage them to make functional rituals or things that they do. Rituals is not the problem. It's that they're dysfunctional. Prayer is a ritual, but if you do it a short amount of time and you're not late to work, it's not dysfunctional. So we try to get them on these sheets to commit to their own beliefs, and that becomes our basis for developing response prevention, because then we want to make response prevention guidelines consistent with the beliefs that they've committed to on these worksheets. And how am I doing on time? Are we out? Do I need to wrap it up?
No, that's okay. Keep going. This is the foundational stuff, so you can dig a little bit deeper in these.
Okay.
These
I wanted
slides.
to give clinicians just to give them a heads up on some of the ways that scrupulous individuals might create obstacles for you. Yes, they can do that sometimes. And it just makes our lives so complicated. So one of the things they might do when I say, well, what do you, is I introduce the concept of choosing their beliefs. Now, that is a scary concept to a lot of people with scrupulosity, because they have the idea that there is a truth and they need to know what it is. How can you choose truth? But if indeed all you have to do, the dictionary is your best friend, because you just open up the dictionary, and I mean metaphorically these days, we don't have to have an actual physical dictionary, but you read the definition of faith, and it says a leap beyond what you can know. Every religion that I know of defines faith in that direction. So if you try to know something, it's no longer faith. And so you have to help people understand that faith is leaping beyond what you can know. So you don't get to know. I'm sorry, you just don't. By the way, that's one of my mottos is my patients don't get anything I don't get. Mm-hmm. And they don't get to know because I don't get to know. I wish I knew, but I don't. So one of those issues is the idea of helping them understand choosing beliefs. They can choose everything in their faith tradition, but they have to choose it. And then another obstacle will come up was say, well, I want to believe this, but it doesn't feel right. So you got to help them sort out feelings are not beliefs. And in fact, the highest order of human functioning is when we can behave in ways contrary to how we feel. Mm-hmm. It's no big deal if I want to punch a wall that I go ahead and punch it. That's not very high moral ground. But when I don't punch it and instead do my therapy exercises that my analyst has taught me, well, no, not that. But at any rate, so
Alex, you remind me of also just wanted to throw in this note that with moral scrupulosity and guilt, we see this a lot where someone decided that they're bad. They have, even after they've kind of looked at the thinking about being bad and challenged that thinking, they still have this residual guilt. And then there's this compulsion to self-criticize and self-deprecate and self-punish, sometimes to get reassurance and sometimes just to sort of even the score. If it's possible that I'm a bad person, I want to make sure that I've at least served some time by feeling really bad. And a lot of the exposure is to go up against that feeling and do what a person would do if they were free, if they felt good about themselves. How would that person behave instead of sitting there ruminating about the guilt and how you're going to address it?
And the guilt becomes proof that they did something wrong, which of course it doesn't, because our brains misfire all the time, whether it's anxiety or guilt or whatever. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to just point out was when I say, well, what do you believe about that? And they'll say, I don't know. That's a very common sort of way to avoid this process. And I said, well, of course you don't know. It's a belief. It's not a truth. It's a belief. And we also go over what's the difference between a truth and a belief, and how do you determine those things. But all of those are some of the tips I would suggest for clinicians, because they're going to run up against that as you try to get them to really clarify their beliefs. But I think this is a very important process, and I haven't researched it in the sense of comparing it to people who haven't had the procedure, because my experience has always been after they've failed in another ERP program, and then they come back, and then we do this work, and then they, I think, do better. But we don't have controlled outcome studies on this. And I want to be clear. This is just a clinical strategy that I think is very, very helpful.
Do you tend to start very early on with most patients into the piece of process, into the education, faith, and belief? Okay.
Right after they pay.
When the credit card clears.
The credit card goes through, we go, all right, now we can go forward, unless they're on a scholarship. But at any rate,
So I run into working with folks when we talk about, I'm with you 100%. We talk about the difference between, faith, belief versus knowing for sure. And I see a lot of folks, particularly Christian folks, because their belief, their religion is very, belief based, very faith based, and they'll say, no, I know for sure that God functions this way. I know for sure this is the right way to do it. How do you address that? Because if you say, well, you don't really know. You have faith, you have a belief, which is, as Justin put up at the bottom, it's taking it a step further than what we know. Sometimes they don't respond so well to being told that they don't know for sure that Jesus, God,
Yes.
whatever. How do you manage that?
Well, that's a good question.
That's why I asked it, my friend.
I know. Thank you very much. Could you answer an easy question? Ask an easy question, please.
No hard questions allowed.
No, it is a common thing that comes up, and it's tricky. You have to play with the words a little bit to get the nuance across. But you can believe with all your heart that this is true, and that's what faith is. But you cannot know, like you can know today is whatever day of the week it is. I keep going back to the definition of faith.
Yeah.
And so you can be 100% confident that your belief is correct. That's okay. But you can't know in the sense, because if you knew for sure, then wouldn't you be God? And look, it's not beneath me to use their own religion against them. And I don't mean it in any terrible bad way. I just mean the honest tenets of their religion.
Yeah.
A lot of
Hold their feet to the fire.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The people who say I know often are talking about beliefs that they're wrong about, which I find really interesting.
Yeah.
They'll say, like, I know,
too.
I know for a fact that, God doesn't like it when you do this or that or whatever. And then I'll say, like, okay, so I want to understand your faith better. You're telling me that the God that you believe in has so much free time and is so bored that he just kind of sits around waiting for you to, like, slip on a banana peel or whatever mistake it is that you made, just so he can delight in punishing you. This seems to run, counter to everything you've told me about God up to this point, which is, compassionate and merciful, all-knowing, all-wise. Sounds to me like you made a mistake or made a poor choice or something like that, and you're describing a God that's totally different from the God that you started describing earlier. And the more confident they are in that, the more likely it is that they're working with bad info.
That's a great point. And I would add, at that point is when I might say, so you're telling me that God made you imperfect. I just want to get clear how you see it. God made you imperfect, and yet he's waiting to pounce on you when any little imperfect thing you do. Do you choose to believe in a God like that? And you come back to the idea of choosing. Why would you choose to believe in, and also something that's not consistent, usually, by the way, with your own faith?
Something that I have found helpful is we define faith, kind of what we've been talking about, and talk about how for the person with scrupulosity, it's like they've lost faith in faith. And they've kind of gone beyond that. They need a guarantee. It's not enough to have the belief. They need to know for sure. And as we've been talking about, that's just not how religion, that's not how the supernatural works. We can't know that. So, in terms of getting back to therapy, why should I do these terrible exposure exercises and response prevention? The goal is to become more faithful and know that you can live with that, that uncertainty, which I wouldn't say this to a person with scrupulosity, but faith and uncertainty are kind of, there's an overlap there. And what we want folks to do is to become more faithful. I find a lot of folks, they'll say, well, you're just trying to make me less religious. Are you trying to turn me into an atheist? No, I want to help you to whatever faith you follow. I want you to become more faithful, a more faithful follower, because clearly that's not the direction you're going.
That's great.
We use faith in most of our decisions too, right? Like, how do I know when I finished washing my hands? How do I know that I'm done? Well, for me, it's like, I don't know. I just assume I did the basics and I move on with my life. But I'll have people tell me, well, the way I know that I've washed my hands is, when they're bleeding. And that way I know for sure that I've done them, enough, right? Like the complete absence of any, and that this is really kind of central to OCD, again, across the board, which is some mechanism in the brain that's supposed to say enough already, you can move on now, isn't firing off. the way it's supposed to.
Yeah.
So you have to do more, you have to check more, you have to like keep doing more to kind of force it to work. And then of course all those compulsions send the exact opposite signal to the brain that that you can know, and then you can sort of move on and use faith to guide you.
That's great. That's great. Let me circle over to some of the research. So when we talk about some of those differences and what's going on in the brain, though we don't have tons and tons of research, as I understand it, there are some differences as far as what the research says, I think. Dr. Abramowitz, can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, there's not a ton of research on scrupulosity, but I guess some of the over the last 10 years or so, some of the more landmark studies, I guess, have found a few things that we can talk about that are pretty interesting, I think. And I think, primarily what these studies suggest is that there are certain cognitive processes that are unique to folks that have scrupulosity relative to folks with other forms of OCD, relative to people who don't have OCD or have other problems with anxiety. These are, in my mind, these are less a problem with the brain, with the hardware of the brain, and more a bias. In other words, they're ways of thinking, they're mistaken ways of thinking. And cognitive behavior therapy is about correcting those kinds of mistakes. So a good example of that is what we call thought-action fusion, right? It's this idea that when we think about something, that's the moral equivalent of doing it. If I think about harming someone I love, that's just as bad as actually doing it. Or if I have some sort of blasphemous thought, then that's just as bad as acting blasphemously. I guess. And, one of the things that is really interesting, a postdoc of mine did a study many, many years ago. In the Bible, there are lots of references to thought-action fusion. A great example, Jesus in the Sermon of the Mount talks about, if you lust in your heart after someone you're not married to, you have committed adultery. It's just as bad. Thinking about it is just as bad as doing it. And there are lots of other places where that plays out as well. And so, although it's never been proven that religion leads to OCD, because it doesn't, the vast majority of religious folks don't have OCD and are perfectly, healthy. But for some folks, for whatever reason, if they latch on to those kinds of beliefs, then that can lead to then interpreting, well, I've had a thought like that. Am I blasphemous? Am I going to hell? Have I committed a sin? And so they start to see their thoughts as sinful. And then, of course, when we try not to think certain thoughts, what happens? We just think about that stuff even more. So the person kind of gets into this vicious cycle where they're playing, a tug of war game that's rigged against them. You can't win that. We know that folks who have scrupulosity, some research suggests that they have more kind of rigid beliefs, these so-called, shoulds and musts and demands about how they should and must behave, very high expectations for their behavior relative to other folks. We know that strong religiosity is a risk factor, right? So you don't see scrupulosity among folks that aren't religious. You don't see religious scrupulosity, but I have seen people with scrupulosity among folks who aren't religious. But for the most part, you do need to be religious in order to have religious scrupulosity. But that doesn't mean that religion causes that. And I think that's really important. You pick up a research article or a description of OCD, and it's really easy to say, well, clearly, your religious background caused you to have OCD, caused you to have scrupulosity. That's, again, like I said, that's not true. What we do know is that the type of OCD symptoms you have is absolutely influenced by your culture, and religion is part of culture. So if you're Jewish, for example, you're not going to have obsessions about, Jesus being upset with you, because that's just not part of Judaism. But you might, and you're likely to have obsessions about, did I keep the laws of kosher? right? It's certain dietary restrictions for Jews. Similarly, if you're Muslim, your OCD symptoms are going to focus on tenets of that religion rather than Judaism or, Christianity, things like that. And there's no evidence that there are differences among different religious denominations in terms of scrupulosity. All of these religions have this dark side, this OCD side, where you can, kind of what we were talking about before, you can take things to the extreme, you can lose faith in your faith, and no matter what religion you are, that can develop into OCD symptoms. When you have these rules, these high standards that need to be followed, and when you have a lot of uncertainty about, there's this deity and I don't know what he's thinking, and I can't know for sure, and I have to have faith, and the threat of some sort of divine punishment, going to hell for all eternity. For some folks, and it'd be great to know who those people are, right? We need more research. That can be a recipe for developing scrupulosity. So I'll leave that there.
Jon, can I ask a nuance about the literature that I wanted to make sure my take on it is similar? If I were to say that the religiosity itself is not associated with scrupulosity in this sense within the individual, in other words, that there is certain kinds of maybe more conservative religious beliefs that create an environment around which a person who's vulnerable to OCD will then develop OCD. But actually, Ted Witzig's study found that religiosity, which is really more of a healthy religion, was actually inversely related to scrupulosity within individuals. In other words, so that religiosity in the healthy definition, and there's different definitions out there, is actually very different than scrupulosity.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I think that most religious folks, they are cool with faith. They're cool with I believe this, even though I can't prove that it's so. And most people, I would guess, most people probably don't even think about it. Like, that's just a belief that they have, and they go about their day. The analogy that I often make is like gravity. We take gravity for granted. We don't think about gravity. We just kind of assume that it's true. And I think that most religious folks, that's just kind of the way that they think about their religion. They don't really think about it too much. Folks with OCD, with clinical scrupulosity, they get caught up in this gap between their belief and what the knowledge that they can never know for sure.
Yeah. That's great. Well, just for time, these are ones we could stick with. I actually want to bounce to a couple of slides, and just as a reminder, of course, we have the Q&A time, and in consultation, we really want to open it up for those interested in case consultation. But an interesting one, I don't know if this gets a lot of coverage, and so I'm just going to jump to it, on therapist disclosure. We even talked amidst ourselves in the planning for this. What, when, how much do you do it? And Jon Hershfield, you had some great ideas as far as how the lack of bias, of course, can be helpful. And Alec talking about why it's sometimes not a good idea to talk about personal beliefs. Curious for everybody to weigh in here.
I'll present my good ideas and then I'll let Alec tear them down. I think that I try to approach every case, every patient, like, it's something I'm going to learn. I'm very interested in people. That's why we get into this business. I'm curious of what makes people tick. Why are they the way that they are? Where do they come from? Where are they going? What do they want? Why do they end up here in this place at this time? So, if we're talking about religious scrupulosity and it's religion that I don't subscribe to, which that would be easy to do, I get very interested. Like, what's it about? If there's a book that they'd like me to read or a website they'd like me to go to, particularly if it's like a sect within a sect, if it's a very sort of specific version of their religion that their OCD is attacked. I like to educate myself on that. It's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of fun. It's kind of interesting. And in some cases, and I realize it doesn't work for every therapeutic relationship, but I do a fair amount of disclosure. There's boundaries that I have, and then when I'm sort of asked about those boundaries, I'll usually say and this is where I draw the boundary because it's kind of how clinical work is. But I will in most situations, dealing with a religious client, I'm kind of an open book. I'm just some guy. I was raised by Jewish New Yorkers on a farm in Maryland, and I'm not a religious person, but I think religion is fascinating, and philosophy is fascinating. So I like learning from different people, and so I'm not. So the sort of the accusation, I think John A. brought it up about like you're going to take me away from my faith or something like that, or maybe something Alec said. No, it's the opposite. Like, you seem to want to do this, and I want to help you to do it. And I think that's pretty cool. And we have enough atheists, so we're fine. I'm not here to like make more. It's really, and in some cases, culturally. So like I come from a Jewish family, so also with when I'm working with an Orthodox Jewish patient, it actually matters to them that I'm a member of the tribe, even if I don't believe in or agree with a lot of what they might strongly believe in or agree with, but there's a sense of safety that they get from that, in the same way that somebody might feel safer with a male therapist or a female therapist or something like that. So if that's helpful, that's fine, and I'm open to using that disclosure. But I'm very curious to hear what Alec has to say, because I know there's lots of ways that this can also backfire. If you open the door up a little bit, sometimes for people it's hard to close later on.
I'm very disappointed. You said nothing that I can tear into. It's very, very pithy, actually. No. I want to say that I don't think there's one way to do it. I might not want to tell people about my background, and what I say to them is, I understand that you are rightfully concerned about whether I will respect your faith. I don't mean it that way. I just meant you don't know me. And a lot of people come in with this idea that all psychotherapists are anti-religion. They're anti-faith, and you've got to be able to navigate around that. But I don't talk about my own personal faith, because if I tell you what my faith is, and you like it, you might use me for a spiritual director, and that's my job, not my job. And if you don't like it, you might use it to unfairly dismiss my attempts to help you. So what I will vow to you is that I will do everything I can to respect your faith tradition. I believe that it's an important part of human existence. And at any point you feel I'm saying or doing something that's not respectful, I hope you will tell me, and see if I can learn from that. And if I can't, I will try to get you a different therapist that you feel more comfortable with. And most of the time, people are fine with that, to be quite frank. Now, we all talked about, if you've got a yarmulke on and you say, well, I'm not going to tell you my faith.
So what's interesting is that, my last name is unmistakably Jewish. But you'd be surprised at how many people, usually non-Jew, the Jews know exactly, but the people who aren't Jewish, they have no idea. It blows me away.
Yeah. Now, Justin, I think you must have a very different perspective. And I do think there are absolutely times where you connect with people. They just are going to feel more comfortable knowing your faith. So I want to be clear. I'm not here to say nobody should ever tell them that. I think it depends on your situation.
Yeah. I think that's one of those areas that it strikes me that it's so important to have very clear boundaries in that. It can so easily spin out of control, patients getting reassurance, even secondary reassurance as well. And so if a person is not aware of that specifically, so I do have to be very careful. I, like Ted Witzig, have a bit of a persona that's for him, his bivocational role as a pastor and psychologist as well. He can't hide that anyway. And so sometimes there's that. But then also with really, really good boundaries, I find that it's similar to other areas, that if it can build a little bit of that rapport and trust early on, and they know that I'm going to say no when asking about certain questions, that can be helpful. But I love the diversity of takes on here, because it can quickly spin out of control.
Yeah, I think it's a similar thing with clinicians with lived experience. And most people know that I have OCD. I've written it in a few books, and it's just something that's known about me. And then when they say, well, what kind of OCD do you have? And that's when I say, wouldn't you like to know?
So saying disclosure is not all or nothing.
That's right.
Yes. Well, y'all, oh my goodness, the time goes so quick, but we still, of course, have time in the Q&A and consultation. We have a bunch of other slides. We didn't talk about working with clergy yet or resistance, but hey, we would like to welcome you into our case conceptualization time. So thank you for being here. And thanks again so far for the recording from Dr. Abramowitz and Pollard and Jon Hershfield. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.